Hello and welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good, and today Bryce Green and I are going to be talking to two outstanding journalists, Mnar Adley and Alan MacLeod from Mint Press News. We'll be talking about Israel's assault on Gaza in general, and in the show notes we've included two links to some of their recent work. From Mnar, we have the Hannibal Directive, What Really Happened on October 7th. I suggest that you check that out. And for Alan, we have Behind Israel's Propaganda Campaign, where he explains just the sheer amount of staggering propaganda that we are being bombarded with constantly. Devil's Chess Club is an American Exception production. Please support American Exception on Patreon if you can. Now let's talk to our guests. We are excited to have two excellent journalists from Mint Press News, Alan MacLeod and Mnar Adley. Thank you both for joining us today.
Hello, thank you.
Great to be with you, Aaron and Bryce.
Yeah, it's great to have you both on. Mint Press has been one of my staple alternative media sites and outlets for quite a while. Once I discovered them, I was still in school, but learning about how, the mainstream sources aren't always as accurate as they purport themselves to be. And piercing through the propaganda about all the different wars, at all the different interventions and policies that the United States has, you guys have been doing an excellent job with that. So can you talk about a little bit how you founded Mint Press News, how you got started, and your journey from, just starting out to being a powerhouse now?
Well, first of all, thank you guys both for having me on today. Mint Press News was founded in 2012. We're an independent watchdog media outlet that looks at the profiteers of the permanent war state. But you could say that Mint Press was really born when I was 13 years old after having lived under Israeli occupation and apartheid for nearly 4 years, where I witnessed grave human rights abuses by the state of Israel. I lived under a two-tier system where Muslims and Christians, Palestinians alike, were treated as second-class citizens at best, and white Jewish Israelis were treated as with more rights. They were given more rights and treated with more rights than Palestinians. And so, as an American, having lived in Palestine, living in Jerusalem, under this two-tiered apartheid system and witnessing a military occupation and having seen and lived through Israeli bombs being dropped on Palestinian homes in Ramallah, having to cross through checkpoints, going to school as a preteen, sometimes with half of the students in my class not present because of the checkpoints and control over Palestinian movement, having our water cut off, living under militarized curfews when visiting family in the city of Hebron. This was very traumatizing for me as a preteen. And so when I had moved back to the United States when I was 13 years old, suffering from PTSD and anxiety and having that survivor's guilt and my mind racing constantly about the war that I had just left behind, I turned to the media at the age of 13 to keep up to date with what was happening in Palestine, only to find a mainstream corporate media that was portraying the crisis in Palestine completely opposite of what it was. And they presented it through the lens of religion, Muslim versus Jew. This fighting has been going on for thousands of years. And never through the lens of modern day colonialism, never through the lens of apartheid, never through the lens of military occupation and warfare. And certainly not the fact that Israel acted as a proxy military state for the United States in the Middle East. And so that became my the first time I had really witnessed how the media flipped the narrative about war and demonized Palestinians as barbaric and backwards and uncivilized. And a couple of months after I moved back from the US, I know this is a long-winded answer, but I hope this answers your question. After a couple of months after I moved back from the US, 9/11 happened. And again, I'm 13 years old, sitting in my classroom as the only Muslim, the only Palestinian, watching the media dehumanize billions of Muslims around the world to justify now the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the things that happened when I was in my junior high is that I saw how the media, CNN and MSNBC, played a video out of Gaza where Palestinians were celebrating Eid, our Muslim holiday, handing out candy, and planted that video after 9/11 and said, look at Palestinians celebrating 9/11. They were in fact not celebrating 9/11. And so this really kind of triggered this interest in me at 13 years old, and kind of allowed me to kind of point my finger at the media, and allowed me to say and to come to the conclusion that it was the media that was allowing these wars to continue, whether it was the war in Palestine and Israel or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where 2 million people died in each of those countries, those devastating wars that were all based on lies of weapons of mass destruction. And so from that moment at 13 years old, I decided to pursue journalism. And every essay, every speech, everything I did moving forward was about becoming the media, changing the media, and with this vision and dream of mine to create a media outlet that would change the face of news and journalism in the United States, because there was a lack of alternative voices in media because of the fact that 6 corporations control 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. And so I saw that as an opportunity. And so after college, I started Mint Press, and slowly but surely, with the support and building the staff, we became the international news outlet that we are today.
Yeah, you guys are a very reliable source on things, especially related to the Middle East, but on U.S. foreign policy in general. And that's amazing to me that you came back to the U.S. And then a couple months later, 9/11 happens, because that was my experience. I actually I lived in Taiwan for 1 year, and then I came back. My contract expired, at the end of August, and so I came back in early September, and then a week later, 9/11 happened, and I didn't actually watch it on TV. It was the weirdest thing. I thought Bush was a gangster who'd kind of stolen the election, and I thought this was really bad, and I thought people are going to go nuts. And it's not like I'm squeamish or something. It's not like I'm afraid of violence. And I was a political science major. I'm kind of a political junkie, but for whatever reason, I was like, I don't need to see this coverage. And that impacted the way I never was behind I thought they'll go into Afghanistan because it just seems like that's unavoidable. But this Iraq thing seems so gangsterish, and yet they did it anyway. But I didn't have that conditioning of watching 9/11, which seems like that's what 9/11 was for, to condition up. I mean, even the one version of explaining 9/11 is that it was a provocation from bin Laden to get us to launch wars to damage U.S. national security, which is a funny and odd thing to think of when you think about it. But what you guys do, so I'm sympathetic. I really am sympathetic to what it must have been like for you, because if it seemed like bullshit to me, I can only imagine as a Palestinian what it would have been like at that time period, and to be there with so much propaganda. And that, Alan, is something that you focus on in your work. I think that's your graduate work too, deals with this work, as I recall. So as a journalist and as an academic, you know a lot about propaganda. What can you say about, you've written about this in many articles, including one a couple of days ago. We'll put in the show notes here. What can you say about this propaganda blitz that's been ramped up, as high as it could be recently, and that's actually not working that well? But what is the state of Israeli propaganda these days, and propaganda about U.S. foreign policy in general?
Yeah, almost as important, and in some ways more important than what's actually going on with tanks and rockets and troops in Gaza, for Israel anyway, is how the world perceives what's going on. So in other words, the propaganda war is more important than the actual military war. Israel has complete control over Gaza and has for decades now. It controls who goes in and out, what goes in and out. It controls the seas, the air, pretty much everything about this narrow, densely populated strip, right? However, what it can't control is how the rest of the world perceives its brutal occupation, its apartheid-like system inside its own country. And it's very important for Israel to try to convince enough people, particularly in the countries that are really the movers and shakers, the United States, Western Europe, to support their campaign, because ultimately they know that their project can only be sustained from outside. And so we're seeing a massive campaign from the Israeli government and the Israeli military to try to convince Westerners in particular, to convince them. One thing they have done, for example, is spend more than $7 million in 2 weeks on YouTube ads, which targeted people all over the world, but primarily in the United States, in Germany, France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. And that $7 million paid for around 1 billion sets of eyeballs to see Israeli propaganda videos presenting Israel as a democratic state under attack from ISIS-like terrorists. They have also been spending big on advertising campaigns on X, formerly Twitter, on Instagram, on online games, and more. But actually, what we're seeing is social media, particularly social media geared towards young people, ones like TikTok, have come out to be very pro-Palestinian. You see the amount of hashtags that are using pro-Palestinian sayings. They're really going exponentially further than the pro-Israel stuff, because the pro-Israel stuff is, to a large extent, artificial and astroturfed. When we talk about the propaganda war and public opinion in the West, it's very interesting to see that it's actually split very clearly along age lines. So you see that people in the United States who are retired, 60 or over, are strongly supportive of the Israeli campaign. But people under 35, the millennials, the Zoomers, have the absolute opposite interpretation of what's going on. And that's not just an age thing. That really reflects the fact that older people in the West still get their news from giant corporations in the form of cable news or from newspapers, right? Whereas younger people tend to get it from social media, which has a lot of problems, but is significantly more democratic in the sense that different ideas will percolate out there, even though the government of Israel does put a lot of pressure on groups, platforms like Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, etc., to take down a lot of pro-Palestinian content. And they have been doing that for years and years. In fact, when we look at who's on Facebook's board of directors, we see there's a former head of the Israeli Justice Ministry there, Amy Palmore, who in her role as Justice Secretary used to oversee basically the process of deportations, of removing Palestinians from their houses, etc. But she also actually put a lot of pressure on Facebook in that role to take down pro-Palestinian content. And the Israeli government once boasted that more than 90% of its requests to Facebook were actually granted. So yeah, Israel is trying very hard to try and control the narrative. But ultimately, when you see how much organic support it has in the world, it's very minimal. How many countries are really going out on a limb to support the Israeli government? There's maybe a handful, the governments of India, the United States, some in Western Europe. But when you look at the rest of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, they're really standing behind the Palestinians. And what's even more interesting is that the people in the global north are highly split. And when you actually look at a lot of the data, even countries with governments that are strongly supportive of Israel are seeing gigantic protests, organic ones, hundreds of thousands of people in the street in places like London, in Paris, in Berlin, in DC, in New York, whatever. So even though the Israelis are trying to win this propaganda war, and they're trying very hard, it's not going very well for them right now.
Yeah, I deeply identify with this idea that the propaganda war is as important, in some ways more important than the actual war, because Israel is only able to operate the way it does with the backing of the Western powers, largely the United States. And that happens through, this is the old term, manufacturing consent in the American population by only portraying one side of the conflict as a legitimate point of view and excluding the others. And I deeply identify with your story, Mnar, although in a different magnitude. I wasn't, there. I didn't directly suffer under the Israeli occupation, but learning about that and watching the media coverage of of Palestine was a real education about how the media system actually operates in America and serves the interests of the corporate establishment and the military establishment. In fact, the first thing I ever wrote was about Palestine, was about the 2018 or 2019 bombing attacks and how they were miscovered by the media and how the reality was far more gruesome than they were letting on. And since then, it's always been a key educational tool for teaching other people about the nature of the American media. And this ongoing attack on Gaza, we've seen the propaganda ramped up to almost unseen levels before. I mean, you mentioned the YouTube ads, but also just the official Israeli accounts. They're just going crazy, tweeting out nonsense, tweeting out ridiculous things, tweeting out Lord Voldemort memes that link to atrocity videos. It's been very bizarre. So I'm curious of for both of you, what have been some of the most extreme examples of Israeli propaganda, misinformation, disinformation throughout this conflict?
Well, when we talk about Israeli propaganda specifically, I mean, let's take the bombing of the Al Ali Baptist hospital that happened recently, where hundreds of people are believed to have been killed in a huge airstrike. Israeli semi-official spokespersons basically took credit for it in the early minutes and hours after the attack, and that was quickly pulled back when it was realized just how many people had died and what the reaction was. And suddenly Israel changed its tune entirely, sending out ridiculous videos that were easily disproven almost immediately because they were from 2022. Or, for instance, putting out audio of what was purported to be Hamas fighters talking to each other, saying actually it was our side that made the mistake, it wasn't the Israelis, etc. But again, immediately when you speak to linguists who actually study this stuff, they said this couldn't possibly be Hamas officials because the accent is wrong, the people aren't speaking in fluent Arabic, etc., etc., etc. And in fact, one company even found that the audio was such that it had been spliced together in a way that was completely unnatural and wasn't from a call at all. So the Israeli government keeps putting out all sorts of extremely easy to debunk propaganda. I mean, just recently, one of the spokespersons for the Prime Minister's office put out a video talking about how Palestinians were staging incidents using crisis actors, and the video they put out was actually from a Lebanese video that came out a couple of years ago. And again, this stuff is so easily disprovable, but it almost doesn't matter because the Israeli government has a lot of allies in Western corporate media. And we have to remember what corporate media is. I mean, they are ultimately gigantic multinational corporations who very much have interests in preserving the global order because their owners and their sponsors in the form of advertisers benefit from this. And so we have seen news media throughout the world parrot very dubious Israeli propaganda. This whole thing started on October 7th. And one of the first things we heard about this Hamas attack was that Hamas committed mass rapes and also beheaded 40 babies. This thing was picked up and was front page news, led bulletins across the world, and even Joe Biden himself said that he had seen evidence of this. And yet there was no evidence. The White House had to ramp it back. There was never really any hard evidence of this. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that the list of casualties on the Israeli side doesn't actually include any children under 3, so certainly not 40. And so this sort of atrocity propaganda, which we've seen time again start wars. I'm thinking of, for example, 2011, when the media said that Gaddafi was giving his soldiers Viagra to rape Libyan rebel women, or how...
We saw that again with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they busted up that exact same line that Putin was giving his soldiers Viagra.
That's right.
Of course, in both cases, they were walked back.
Sure. We can go even further back. The Gulf War One was started with lies about Iraqi soldiers taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators and killing them or putting them on bayonets. And this sort of stuff actually goes back to the very dawn of propaganda, or public relations, as it's called, with the Committee on Public Information in World War One in the United States, where Americans were bombarded with atrocity propaganda about the German forces. And that turned a very passive, pacific American population into ranting, jingoistic warmongers who pretty much supported President Wilson's decision to take the United States to war. And so, yeah, this sort of stuff, this atrocity propaganda works, and we're seeing it time and time again. But every time you look into it, sometimes these claims actually fall apart.
Mnar, what's been your how has this been for you the last month? Like, I mean, you have to run Mint Press, but also you have a personal connection to this. I mean, I'm steeped in the U.S. atrocities, and like, I mean, the structural violence kills like 9 million people a year that the U.S. presides over. I can be a little numb to these things because I don't have any personal connection to Palestine or any of these crisis zones, really. How have you been able to handle this day to day while you're trying to perform professionally, but steeped in something that has to be really personally taxing and psychically kind of just torturous for you?
Well, I think you described that pretty well. It has been psychologically and emotionally very difficult to process just the amount of death and destruction and that has been taking place in Gaza, to watch over 10,000 people be killed in the blink of an eye, and just to watch all of these children being killed, these images of babies, limbs being all over the place, parents carrying the limbs of their children, their dead children, in grocery bags. It's been quite psychologically devastating. And on the other hand, while running Mint Press, we're working around the clock to counter the propaganda. And one of the biggest things that we've been trying to counter is the Israeli propaganda machine, and also the US media, corporate media propaganda machine that pushes soft propaganda in the way that it frames what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza in a way that truly does manufacture consent for Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity that it's committing in Gaza. And one of the things that we've really been trying to do is counter this atrocity propaganda that Alan has been talking about. The whole basis of the war is based on one gigantic lie. What happened on October 7th, what we've come to know to be fact on October 7th, is in fact not fact at all, factual. We have been lied to about the events of October 7th, and certainly we might not ever really truly know exactly what happened, but a lot of things that we've come to know have turned out to be false and fake information that has been pushed by the Israeli military and by the Netanyahu government and its media, the Israeli media. But luckily, the way we've been able to find out what's true and what's not is also from within the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and the Israeli media. What is not being discussed about October 7th is how the Hannibal Directive was being used on October 7th. The situation escalated on October 7th, not when the Hamas fighters paraglided out of the Gaza prison and onto the military bases. It was, in fact, now we know more, and this is, again, information we're receiving from the Israeli police reports and military reports, is that when the Hamas fighters came into the military bases, it was the Israeli police and military that initiated the heavy gunfire. And we have many videos that we have analyzed to showcase this. We also have video of Israeli tanks firing at the music festival and where Hamas fighters fired back. But it was the Israeli soldiers and the Israeli police who initiated all of the gunfire. And at one point, we know that when Hamas overran an Israeli military base on October 7th at the Erez crossing, Brigadier General Avi Rosenfeld, the commander of the base, actually called in an airstrike on his own position, even as he and countless others were stationed there and still fighting Hamas. And this was reported by Haaretz newspaper in an investigation that they conducted. And more of the numbers that are coming out of those killed, as mentioned, or Alan mentioned, there was nobody killed under the age of 3. But now we are learning that over 80% of those killed were in fact Israeli soldiers. And so the entire basis of Hamas coming in and just shooting at people at this music festival, that Hamas was kidnapping Israelis like Shani Luke and killing them and raping them, all of this information has turned out to be false. Now, did Hamas take hostages, prisoners of war? That is absolutely true. Did Israelis die because of this gunfire, being caught between the gunfire? That is also true. But the whole basis of this shock and awe that Hamas came in and mass raped women and that they just opened fire on a music festival, all of those things turned out to be false, including the story of the 40 beheaded baby story. Those things have all been backtracked. And so it's been overwhelming, I guess you could say, to witness these atrocities being that are taking place inside of Gaza, while also simultaneously fighting this gaslighting that we're experiencing within the media. Even though a lot of this information that I'm sharing with you about October 7th are factual, the media is still running with the fact that Hamas beheaded 40 stories. Politico just last week led with one of their articles. The first line was about how these 40 beheaded babies were buried. A complete lie. And that was the first line of a Politico article. The New York Times still running with this story. Another thing that these media outlets are running with is this idea that Hamas has these like unlimited tunnels of where they're all under hospitals and they're all under homes and schools, and basically putting all the blame on Hamas for what Israel is committing, which is, Israel's committing war crimes. And so again and again, we're seeing a media that is dehumanizing Palestinians, framing what happened on October 7th as a barbaric act with rape and beheadings, and then blaming Palestinians for their own deaths. And this is not a new tactic within media propaganda. We saw this kind of dehumanization of the victims of our war when the US launched its wars on Afghanistan and Iraq. Living in a post 9/11 America, I saw and lived through the way the media dehumanized Muslims constantly to frame the men as barbaric, as aggressive. And that is just certainly not the case. That is just not the case. I just went to Palestine. I was just there this summer, luckily before this war broke out, but I was just there in the month of July and August for 2 months. And I saw the two-tiered apartheid system once again. I hadn't been there for 18 years, but I saw the occupation expand. And it's really interesting how the media can push all of this dehumanization of the people that are living under these bombs, because that's the only way that they can justify Israel's crimes. I mean, look at the New York Times, for example. The New York Times bureau in Jerusalem is built on a Palestinian home, the home of a Nakba survivor, a woman named Ghada Karmi. She's an activist. The New York Times ethnically cleansed a Palestinian family's home so they can build the New York Times bureau in Jerusalem. The New York Times takes gag orders from the state of Israel on what they can and cannot publish about the crisis in Palestine and Israel. They've been taking gag orders or responding to gag orders from Israel for many years. The New York Times bureau chiefs based in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv have their offspring serving in the Israeli military. And so there's a clear conflict of interest within corporate media. And that is just the New York Times. That doesn't even go on to mention the other media outlets and how they really cannot purport to be neutral on the crisis, because in reality, they work directly a lot of times with the Israeli government or with the Israeli lobby. Honest Reporting is an Israel lobby group that has lobbied the New York Times, again, to fire their Palestinian employees, their Palestinian photojournalists and journalists. And so we have a huge conflict of interest when it comes to corporate media and their relationship with the Israeli government and the Israeli lobby, which is why it's so important to turn to independent media. But that's also why big tech, under the demands of the Israeli lobby and the US government, are working so hard to crack down on alternative information and independent media, because that's where we're going to find factual reporting on war. Because the media that we have today, they don't act as a watchdog to those in power. In fact, they act as a lapdog to those in power. They're working at the behest of those in power. Whereas independent watchdog journalism is truly holding the war class accountable, and that's why they fear us so much.
Yeah, Mnar, you have to leave a little bit early, so I'm gonna throw another question at you before we go back to Alan here. So apologies, Alan, but since Mnar has limited time, I want to ask this. So I am this what you've been saying there recently, I think is inspiring, because I feel like, to me, it seems like if you're thinking about how you're going to process this, what better way to do it than something that's constructive? And so I think that, like, the way that you are trying to at least adhere to the belief that the truth might somehow set us free, I think that's really respectable. I look back on these issues in the Middle East and the conditions in the Middle East, and it seems to be the kind of ultimate example of what the West and the Atlanticists have really been about. Because if you trace, World War I has origins connected to the Middle East as well. People don't realize that a lot of this was fears over Germany having access to oil, around, that had been discovered in Mesopotamia and so on, and the Brits, fearing this, take actions that end up escalating into World War I. And so this is like a hugely contested area. And if you look at the Middle East, the Muslim Brotherhood was a British enterprise. Like, they backed these kind of people as a counterweight to, like, secular reformers in the Middle East. And then they also inject Zionism as a kind of way to have a different kind of colonial strategy. And so the Brits especially, but then the US picks up this project. They take over management of all, white guy chicanery or imperial crimes around the world. They become the big mafia leader after World War II. But, like, in this, you can see that the Atlanticists, the Brits, they have this, on the one side, they're backing the worst Muslim Islamist elements, and have in Saudi Arabia, everywhere else, the Muslim Brotherhood. And then they back the fanatical Zionists as well. And then later, as things evolve, you have the people, the right-wing Israelis backing groups like Hamas on purpose to have the most aggressive and least sympathetic face for Palestine. I mean, how do you? We now have Putin coming out and saying that the U.S. is really the heart of this. They profit from all this instability, all this divide and rule chicanery all around the world. That's all they have for the whole world. Do you think we're at a moment now where the mask is, like, falling off and more people are able to see, like, this is really what the Western Empire is all about, and it's centuries now, and the whole world kind of recognizes it? And even in the U.S., you've got majorities favoring a ceasefire here. So,
yeah,
I mean, are we at an inflection point where if we can keep a big war from breaking out, the tide is going to turn here?
Well, the tide is turning, and it's been turning slowly but surely. But I think what is taking place now is that a genocide is being televised on TV and on our social media feeds. And so Israel and the United States have certainly shot themselves in the foot, because now is a crucial time in history where we're seeing mass population across this country, across Canada, across Europe, across Asia, South America, across the entire world. We have never seen so many people united for the cause of liberating Palestine. I mean, this is a moment in history that we can that we can really, really cherish. If anything positive has come out of this genocide, is that it has united people across religious lines, ethnic lines, political lines to support the liberation of Palestine, and has exposed the moral depravity of the so-called rules-based order that have ruled over us for so long, who have weaponized human rights, who have weaponized democracy to expand their occupations, to expand their financial interests, to expand their warfare, their exploitation, and their occupation of the world. And so that's the one positive thing that has happened. And of course, I'm not a historian, but the United States is actively engaging in this genocide. The United States has blood on its hands. The United States is not only enabling and abetting this, but they're directly profiting off of this war. And so we have to remember that not only is Netanyahu the butcher a war criminal, but Joe Biden is a war criminal. And he's not the first war criminal that has led this country. Obama is a war criminal. George Bush is a war criminal. Clinton is a war criminal. And the many presidents before them have been war criminals. And so it's not surprising that Joe Biden is supporting this war. And of course, we can't just put the blame on the president, right? You know, these people have handlers that work in the White House, that work in Washington, D.C., the many think tanks like the Atlantic Council, the Heritage Foundation, the weapons manufacturers, the lobby groups like the Israel Lobby and others who are working around the clock to ensure that our politicians are given a lot of money and they're given directives to speak on behalf of the Israeli war machine. And we can't just talk about the Israeli war machine as a singular thing, because it doesn't work and act on its own. The Israeli war machine and the Israeli state act as a military proxy that fuels the military industrial complex for the United States. So we are living in a historic moment where people are united more than ever, and we have to do more than just go out. I just tweeted about this yesterday. We can't just protest and march on the streets anymore. It's time for civil disobedience. It's time for boycotts. It's time for sit-ins. It's time to shut the whole system down. That's why they fear us. That's why they're cracking down on our rights. That's why they're trying to ban protests. That's why they're trying to label us as anti-Semites every time we speak up about Palestine. You're called an anti-Semite for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and yet you have Israelis openly talking about wiping out Palestinians, over 2.3 million Palestinians out of Gaza, to build Starbucks and McDonald's and amusement parks. What do you call that? Well, that's genocide. That's genocidal white supremacist rhetoric. But that serves the United States corporate interests. Why not open up a Starbucks on the beach coast of Gaza? Why not open up a McDonald's? That's good for business. And so we have to now, because we are yielding so much power, we the people are yielding so much power right now, we have to take this to the next level of putting pressure on the political system to remind them that, hey, we elected you guys. You don't work for the weapons manufacturers. You don't work for the lobby groups. You don't work for Israel. You work for us, we the people of the United States. And the same thing for people in Britain, the same thing for the people of Canada. We can't just organize these marches with the cooperation of the police and the local, county anymore. We have to actually put pressure through the sit-ins, the boycotts, and shutting these weapon manufacturers down. That's the only way that we are going to win in stopping a genocide from happening. That's all we're trying to do, is say enough killing, enough murder, enough savagery. The real savages are those in power with the guns, with the money, with the tanks, dropping bombs on innocent people. Those are the real terrorists. Those are the real savages. Those are the real uncivilized people that rule us.
Do you think, this might be the last question before you go, Mnar, do you think that the U.S. has designs on a wider war here? Or elements, I am personally convinced that some people, like of the Victoria Nuland mode, are thinking like this could be a way to start a war with Iran, or to really go into have an excuse to go into Syria. I mean, do you think that there's that if other countries intervene, that this would be a wider war, and that in some ways elements in the U.S. are perhaps hoping for such a thing? I mean, this is what makes this situation so potentially explosive, is that if Hezbollah enters in force, or if Iran somehow responds to what's happening in Gaza, or any other country, that it would give them an excuse to launch wars against these people. But I have to think other people in the U.S. realize like this would put the U.S. in a really bad position. But what do you see here as far as a bigger game being played, even going beyond what's going the sort of hellish situation in Gaza right now?
I do believe that there are many U.S. politicians here that would love nothing more than for a war with Iran. And these are people like Marco Rubio and others who have supported the U.S. maximum pressure campaign against Iran through economic sanctions. These are the same people that have supported sanctions against Venezuela and Cuba, and 25% of the world's population, of governments that don't support U.S. imperialism. So there's no doubt that those people do exist. But the military planners know that the United States cannot win a war with Iran. And so while we do have those hawkish voices, we do know from inside the US government and the military planners that they know that a war with Iran cannot be won. Iran is almost 2.5 times the size of Iraq. And that population in Iran, I would say over 90% of the population is ready to take up arms and serve their country in a war against any invader. Okay, so it's a war that cannot be won. I think Iran's population, I don't remember the number, but it's a very large number for population-wise. Somebody can look it up. But the US and no country would win a war with Iran. So the people who want war with Iran is Israel. And it's the Israel lobby. They're willing to pull the United States and American soldiers and the American citizens into a war that would not end well for anybody. And it wouldn't even end well for Israel. And Israel right now, today, has several nuclear weapons, if not hundreds, pointing directly at Iran. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. And if they don't even have any weapons pointing at anybody. And we know this. We know that they don't have nuclear weapons. And so Israel is the one who's trying to pull the United States into a war with Iran. And they have expanded their warfare against the people of Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, with an intent to try to draw Hezbollah into a war with Israel. But Hezbollah is also not playing that game. Hezbollah was formed to protect southern Lebanon, an armed resistance group that was there to protect and defend and liberate southern Lebanon from Israel's invasion before. And so I don't think the United States wants a broader war with Iran, because they know it's a war that they cannot win. And it's a war that the world would not support either. We are living in a new world right now, a multipolar world. We're moving in that direction where the United States is rendering irrelevant very soon. We have the rise of Russia, the rise of China, and the rise of Iran. China is investing billions of dollars into Iran, a country that has been sanctioned for over 60 years. And because of how largely educated Iran's population is and how large their population is, their economy is about to just explode on the international market. And so apart from all of the warfare that we're talking about, we have to remember that Iran simply poses an economic threat to Israel. And Iran has, for over 60 years, of course, like any other country, it's going to have its internal problems. But overall, Iran has always been an anti-imperialist state, just like Venezuela, just like Cuba. And they don't want the US or Great Britain or any of the European countries to influence and to occupy their economy and their natural resources. And that's their right. And so that's where Iran really poses a threat. And so I do believe Israel is the one who's trying to pull Iran into this war, but I don't think Iran is going to respond and get into the war. And neither will Hezbollah, and they made that very, very clear. They're going to defend themselves. And Israel, of course, doesn't care. They do what they do best, is that they are raining bombs and they're airstriking southern Lebanon. And the US already occupies a third of Syria, where it is occupying the most oil and natural resource-rich region in Syria. And by the way, the reason Israel is raining bombs on Gaza and not really expanding its land operation, even though they've entered, but they're not doing it at a very large scale, is because they can't win a ground invasion. They can't, because Palestinians there are defending their land. And there's also a lot of misinformation, by the way, about Hamas. Okay, Hamas is not like a small group of people. It's over 40,000 people. It's an elected government. And they have dedicated their political actions and motivations to defend the Gaza Strip against Israeli bombs and invasion. So a lot of people like to point them hands at Hamas and say, well, if Hamas didn't exist, well, if Hamas wasn't responding with rockets, well, what do you want Palestinians to do? You want them to just not respond and do anything? Then march? Well, Palestinians have been marching to the security fence to the border of Israel for decades. And all they've been asking for is for lifting the siege to allow for basic necessities like water and humanitarian aid to enter. 2 years ago, over 70,000 Palestinians marched to the Gaza border every Friday. And you know what Israel did? They sniped the people. They sniped the men, the women, the paramedics. They killed them point blank. And they were told to target pregnant women. They were told to target the limbs, the knees, the ankles of men so that they wouldn't die, but so that they could live amputated. They could live in misery. How sadistic. So we have to really ask ourselves, what do we want Palestinians to do? We can point our fingers at Hamas all we want, but they have a right under international law as an occupied people who have been living under occupation and have been ethnically cleansed for over 70 years to pick up arms and resist. And look what Israel is doing now. It's out in the open, their plan. Their plan is now to ethnically cleanse the 2.3 million Palestinians out of Gaza for the Greater Israel Plan, to forcibly evict them and push them into the Sinai Desert, where the United States has already requested billions of dollars in so-called humanitarian aid, where we as the American public are footing the bill, the taxpayer, to fund these tent cities that they're going to push all these people out and basically force them to live in a desert in tents as refugees. And we're footing the bill. So Israel can take the miles of gas reserves across the Gaza Strip and build a Ben Gurion canal on the Red Sea port so that they can have access to the international trade that's happening in those ports. So in the end, we can talk about, what wars are really about. They're really just about extracting resources and economic interests.
Mnar, thank you very much. I will we'll say goodbye to you now and let you go to your next interview that you have. And Alan's going to stick around for a few minutes. So
Awesome.
Mnar, it's great to see you again. I hope to see you in person again, and maybe in the Bay Area again with our guy Mickey Huff. But thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much, and keep up the amazing work. I'll be watching. Let me know when this comes out. I'd love to make a couple clips out of it. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. You should. Very good.
Okay. Bye-bye, guys.
This propaganda war, that you're talking about, or that we've been talking about, includes things like omitting the realities of the bombing campaign, all this propaganda about Hamas and how what Hamas is and whether or not Hamas is a group that can be negotiated with. But one of the arenas that we talk about this in, I mean, we all use Twitter quite a bit. But Alan, you recently wrote an article about how the community notes feature is being manipulated by the pro-Israel mob gang or whatever. And in my opinion, the community notes feature was one of the least bad things that the new Musk Twitter has done. Mostly because I guess I've seen people I dislike and people who lie get absolutely destroyed by a well-placed community note. But as you've written, the opposite is sometimes true, and it's actually happened to me one or two times. But can you explain a little bit about how this community notes feature actually works and the ways in which it's been manipulated by the pro-Israel partisans?
Sure. Well, community notes is a new function on Twitter that's really designed to fight false information. And I think it basically has good intentions. How it works is if you want to sign up to become a community note moderator, you can do that. And the point of community notes is that there is plenty of false information on Twitter there. And if enough people in the community see a post and they decide that something about it is blatantly incorrect, they can add a note to something saying, hey, this video is actually from 2017, not from now, so bear that in mind. Something like that. It's a good idea in a lot of senses. It takes away the fact-checking prestige and power from big organizations like PolitiFact or the Washington Post or whoever else decides that they're the arbiters of truth and falsehoods online or in the world generally. However, the fact that anybody can just sign up to become a community note moderator does lead to some problems, right? Because if enough people,
Alan, it's got to be the Wikipedia thing again, right? It's like, who's going to be able to have resources to get people doing this? Am I right here?
Absolutely, yeah. I made that comparison myself in my own brain. It's a good idea in practice because you think, well, anyone can do it. But the reality is that anybody can't do it because most people have jobs or most people don't even speak English and most people don't have time to do, patrol social media to write notes down. And so ultimately what's going to happen and what we're seeing with this campaign here and this war that's going on, or though I probably shouldn't even call it a war, it's a slaughter really, is that mobs of pro-Israel trolls are flooding this community notes feature and trying to add sticky notes to pretty much any viral post that shows Palestine in a good light or Israel in a negative one. And whenever that note is on a function or a post or whatever, it's like a red badge of shame. It's a warning label. And it also means that posts are demonetized and probably won't be seen by nearly as many people. And so if you work in unison, you can really do a fair amount to try to curb how social media is perceived, the whole public perception, what people see and what people don't see. And as you said, Aaron, it is kind of reminiscent of Wikipedia, whereby in theory, anybody can edit that encyclopedia. But in practice, what happens is that, again, you need to have certain skill set, you need to speak English, you need to have the free time, etc., to go on Wikipedia and do these things. And furthermore, people who spend more time on there and make more edits have more prestige and rank up to higher levels so that their edits stick, which means that organized groups can actually use Wikipedia to try and push agendas, try and remove things from articles. And there are groups that offer their services to anybody who is willing to pay, whether it's corporations or governments, to clean up their Wikipedia page. I mean, Mint Press's Wikipedia page is absolutely awful, and it's being constantly targeted and vandalized by trolls who many people suspect have close ties to the government. And so in that way, you can try and shoot the messenger to begin with. And I think that's what we're seeing as just one part of the Israeli strategy to try and win over as many people to their position as possible.
Yeah, it's like the free press in America. Anybody can have a free press, right? Or it's like the campaign system. We're all equally free to give $1 million to a politician. Well, that's great, but how does that work in practice?
Yeah, I've been using this that feature where you rate the community notes, and sometimes I'll see one that's like especially egregious. I'll be like, downvote. Not helpful. Not true. Do you know if that like what mechanisms actually lead them to remove a note? Because I had a note removed from one of my tweets, but I've never looked deeply into the actual mechanisms. Is it a black box, or is there an actual like function that you can look at?
It's not clear, actually. I did try and look at this as well, but again, Twitter is changing so often with Elon Musk. It seems like every week some new feature comes out and another one is dropped, and the algorithms are tweaked constantly. So we don't really know, but it does certainly seem that if enough people put up enough resistance to community notes, they can get taken down. And again, just as if enough people decide to say a community note is helpful and it should be stickied, then it will get stickered onto posts. So really, I think it is some kind of system of upvote, downvote, or positive, negative, thumb up, thumb down, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, but it's not clear. There's no numbers regarding it in the sense that we can just look at how many people have said this is helpful and how many are saying this is unhelpful.
Yeah, it's interesting to see. The sheer volume of nonsense that goes unchecked on well, not just Twitter, but also the rest of these platforms. But one gang of people I haven't seen, at least in the press, but one gang of people I haven't seen is the disinformation researchers, the
OSINT
self-styled,
guys, yeah.
or the OSINT guys, or all the people who are just concerned about the flood of the fire hose of falsehood is what they called it when they accused Russia of doing it. But you don't see them out much now, or is that just me and my bubble? I don't see many op-ed pages in the mainstream publications talking about it. In fact, I saw one talking about how Russia and Iran and China are utilizing propaganda online to push anti-Israel messages. Is that really the extent of the problem, or what's going on here?
No, listen, if you set yourself up as a fact checker, meaning that you are the arbiter of what is true and what is false, and you're actually getting paid for that, the chances are is that you are very close to some sort of large government or large corporation or some big think tank that is actually paying your wages, because you can't make a living doing that as like some individual fact checker, because nobody wants to pay for that because it's not really that useful a service. And so these people are very closely connected with Western state power. And of course, they don't want to scrutinize the United States' closest ally in the region, because they're ultimately there to uphold Western power. So when we talk about fact checkers and these people who do open source intelligence stuff, they tend to represent a sort of centrist viewpoint, and they tend to go after people from the radical left or the radical right, and try to attack them, but using the language of facts and open source intelligence to make it seem like their own biases are actually the natural way of things, rather than them being absolutely as ideologically committed as the most zealous Marxist or Maoist or fascist or whatever. And that's ultimately what's going on here, especially when it comes to the OSINT guys, which stands for Open Source Intelligence. Half of those guys are in work for organizations which are directly funded by groups like the National Endowment for Democracy or the Atlantic Council, the NED, of course, being a front group for the CIA, and the Atlantic Council being the brains of NATO. And so ultimately, you really can't trust what these sorts of people are saying when those are the sorts of organizations that are paying their wages. Hence why they're so quiet right now, because they really don't want to look at Israeli crimes and dissect how Israel is lying in the media.
Yeah, and between that and what's happening in Ukraine, it just is like, it seems so disastrous for the West at this particular moment, and no amount of propaganda can really cover this up. I think if Israel proceeds and just commits a genocide in Gaza, it seems like it will be a Pyrrhic victory for them, because they already have committed genocidal crimes, I would argue, based on what they've done, to date. But they will it looks so bad for the United States, and with the internet being what it is, it seems that this is really kind of an untenable thing. Are we reaching the point where the propaganda is no longer effective? I look at some things that have happened recently. Even I spend too much time talking about the Kennedy campaign, but setting aside his actual candidacy and positions on things, it's remarkable that a guy would be running and entering, over 20, polling at over 20%. He's like, 13 points behind the other two guys. When the media has done nothing but slander this guy, is this one more indication that like the public is starting to become reflexively distrustful of whatever the press says? I think that on some level that may be happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think the US press still does a reasonably good job in convincing the US public to support whatever position it wants. Of course, trust in media has been absolutely cratering in the past 40 years or more. It goes back to the 1980s when these polls were started to be taken, and you can see that trust in the media has basically been going down year on year. Nevertheless, we do live in a system in the West where we are absolutely dominated by just a handful of gigantic transnational corporations which set the agenda. The big newspapers are owned by oligarchs or big international companies. Same goes for all the big TV stations. However, just because you're able to convince the American public of something doesn't mean that the world is going along with it. And when you look at what's going on with world public opinion and this particular conflict, or with Russia and Ukraine, it's clear that the United States hasn't been able to convince people in the global South, particularly even governments in the global South, to go along with this. I mean, I'm no fan of Russia, but it is pretty surprising that something like 85 to 90% of the world lives in countries which have refused to go along with the US and NATO's plan to sanction Russia. And when it comes to Israel-Palestine, the world is looking aghast at what's going on. There are constantly votes in the UN with totals of something like 185 to 3, 189 to 2, all of them condemning Israel for what they're doing. And the two countries that are always against it are the United States and Israel. And now what we're seeing with social media is that more and more different and diverse opinions can be at least heard. And that's what we're seeing with young people who are just rejecting this outright, young people in the West. And that's precisely why politicians in the United States and Western Europe are now re-exploring the idea of just straight up banning TikTok completely, because it's not completely under control from the Western governments, because it ultimately does have some form of independence, being as it is an organization that was basically developed from China.
They've taken, I mean, they've appointed people that are connected to the U.S. national security to work in TikTok.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
the problem with TikTok, is it partly the format is just not good for what the U.S. does, because you can do short videos that really debunk U.S. narratives? Or is the problem that even with people there policing things, the policing is not as opaque, and so they can only do so much with that? And so it's like, even with TikTok trying to cooperate, just the fact that they will not be completely secretive and sinister and manipulative about the way that they handle their censorship regime or content moderation or whatever you want to call it. I mean, what is the deal with TikTok? Because it seems like TikTok is trying to be a good little corporate friend to the United States in a way, but like the U.S. Imperialists keep getting their asses kicked on TikTok. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, to be honest. When we talk about TikTok, it's a platform that doesn't really allow for nuance, right? It's it's a platform, if you don't know, it's a video platform which allows you to upload very short videos. That is not great for trying to convince people and trying to argue people out of long-held beliefs when it comes to geopolitics or something. It's very hard to try and sway someone's opinion in 30 seconds or a minute or whatever in video. And as you said, Aaron, TikTok has been playing ball with the US government. I've written a number of articles about this. One of them is called The NATO to TikTok Pipeline: Why is TikTok employing so many national security agents? Which really goes into how a few years ago, you might remember, there was this big hullabaloo with the Trump administration talking about banning TikTok, and then they were going to sell it to Bill Gates and Microsoft. And then that deal fell through, and then suddenly nobody was talking about banning TikTok in the end. And what actually happened was TikTok, representatives of TikTok went over to the US and signed something called Project Texas, which was a more than $1 billion initiative to take all the data from TikTok users and send it and put it literally in offices in Texas so that the US government would have much more control over it. And not only that, at the same time, TikTok started to employ just a plethora of people from the US national security state, whether that's NATO officials or people from the FBI or CIA or NSA. And these people were parachuted in to very senior positions into the company, not in politically neutral fields like marketing or customer service, but in things like trust and safety and content moderation, the stuff that actually matters in the end, the stuff that means that you are in control of the algorithm. And yet, despite that, TikTok does seem to have considerably more independence than other social media platforms. However, I would say Israel seems to be getting their ass kicked on many platforms. If you go to Twitter, which is one I use a lot, and if you go to the official, at Israel or at IDF, these official accounts, they are getting ratioed constantly. They're to the point where they're being absolutely derided in their comments. People are totally laughing about how obtuse and unbelievable their propaganda is. And so really in social media, I think it's not just the TikTok factor, but it really is across the board. The Israeli position is not doing well.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. And I don't think that I don't know that they're going back from this. I think that, what Mnar was saying about the younger generation, I think that is really important. And I don't see the younger people, even younger Jewish people, are increasingly some of the most outspoken critics of Israel, because honestly, when it comes down to it, probably the worst thing that's happened to Jewish people has been the state of Israel in the bigger sense, because Israel and its flags are always trying to make it synonymous with Judaism, which is actually a pretty, that's a very dubious thing. And so I'm wondering if they're ever going to really be able to get back to where they were, because to me, the main thing that they try to obscure as much as possible is just the brutal reality of the situation. And I think more people are just starting to ask the simple question of, like, why would people want to break out of Gaza and start killing Israelis? Or why do they need to break out of any place in the first place? Where do these people live day to day? What is their life like? And when you start to answer that question, their religion or the ideology of Hamas kind of becomes irrelevant, because you can just think like, well, what kind of people wouldn't want to kill their tormentors if they were placed under those conditions? Like pretty much anybody, any man who would want to call himself a man would not want to submit to that kind of brutalization for you and your family, and going back and into the future. It's just, to me, it's really something to see this change taking place.
And I think it's also reflective of the material conditions across the West for young people as well. I mean, Western capitalism was booming in the late 20th century. For people of that generation, there was something of a promise that if you worked hard, you might be able to own a house, get a good job, have a decent life. But that sort of thing has really been taken away from so many people in Western Europe and North America right now. So many people under the age of 30, under the age of 40 are kind of giving up on the sort of American dream. And so ultimately people are more disenchanted with everything to begin with. And they are much more questioning of the political and economic system that we live under than their parents' generation was.
Yeah,
And this
as
is
a
just
young
one.
person, as a young person hanging around a bunch of college students now, you can definitely see that. I mean, even I came to undergrad in 2016, which for a lot of people was a major moment where people were getting politically educated and understood, because they were all scared of the Trump phenomenon and they wanted to understand it better. Uh, and I tell this story about how in 2018, me and friends, we started the IU Palestine Solidarity Committee, where we were, we learned about the realities of the occupation and the U.S. support for it. And at our first couple meetings, there were, more Zionists than there were pro-Palestinian students. But this year, even a few years later, our call-out meeting had 200 people show up. And so people, there are more leftist groups on campus, and they're more active, and they're more serious about the work that they do, the education that they're receiving, and the facts and realities of American empire. You can have a coherent conversation with like an 18-year-old just coming onto campus about American empire, colonialism, and Israel's role in it. You can have a better conversation with them than you can some professors here. So I see the shift in the young people, and maybe they're blaming that on TikTok, which is why they want to ban it. But it is heartening to see.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can cut the flowers down, but you can never stop the spring, I guess.
Absolutely.
Alan, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I actually have a heart out myself here for a meeting on the subject of Israel-Palestine, if you can believe it. So thank you so much for coming on. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you and to Mnar. And I really salute you for all the great work you guys are doing at Mint Press. We'll put links to your work. Anything else you want to promote here before we sign off?
No, I just think, yeah, Mint Press, follow me on social media. You can find me anywhere. Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thanks,
Good to
Alan.
speak with you.
Devil's Chess Club is an American Exception production. Special thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode and to Casey Moore for the graphics. To get first access to episodes of Devil's Chess Club, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Subscribers also get over 150 American Exception episodes and counting, all dealing with the deep, dark politics of U.S. empire. After that, you can find episodes on Rockfin Premium, then Rumble, and the American Exception channel on YouTube. I'm very pleased that we were able to get Mnar and Alan to come on Devil's Chess Club. Please check the show notes for links to the articles from Mnar and Alan. I have a little photo here that I want to share with you all here with a backstory. From the left, it's Mark Crispin Miller, and then me, and then Abby Martin. This was from Project Censored's 40th anniversary conference back in 2016. Funny thing is that it was actually Mnar who took the picture. At that conference, Abby and Mnar and Mark were on a big keynote panel with David Talbot. And it is kind of funny now, but after the panel, David Talbot was sitting at a table using his phone, and I was going to say hello to him and talk about the Kennedy assassinations because I'd been following his work for a while and really admired it. But I sort of dallied, and then he left before I got a chance to even say hello. Now 7 years later, and here we are. He's doing a show. He's off this week, but he'll be back. I need to get Mark and Abby on the show too sometime soon because they're both great guests. They'd be great for the show. But sad story now about this. The next year at the Project Censored conference, when I interviewed Peter Dell Scott and Dan Ellsberg for their first interview together, that was really cool. And that one we actually do have. We released those discussions, and I put together a panel on the deep state at that conference, the 2017 one. And that panel had Peter Phillips, Abby Martin, me, Mark Crispin Miller, and it was moderated by Mickey Huff. It was a fantastic, very cool discussion. And the recording was totally unusable. So the panel is lost to history, sadly. It's a really bummer. Last thing I want to mention is our man in Russia, their top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, and he had some things to say, and Financial World now sticking it to the U.S. empire, apparently, by doing a write-up on this. But I got to read some of this because it echoes things that Putin was saying, and it's really something. The Western world's foreign policy, according to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, is not characterized by double standards, but really the main principle: we are in charge and we will pursue our interests. Where we cannot achieve our desired results, we will resort to destabilizing situations and exploit the resulting chaos. Okay, that's his view of what the U.S. does. How dare he say those true things about us? Lavrov criticized the U.S., highlighting that its international interventions since the 50s have seldom yielded positive outcomes for the regions or countries it sought to influence. There's a strong case to be made for that analysis. He argued that Washington's primary aim appears to be to sow discord and upheaval with the expectation that these troubled regions will eventually turn to the U.S. for assistance, often in the form of printed dollars. Yep, that's the pattern. He warned countries seeking help from the U.S. to recall the experiences of past leaders who pinned their hopes on American support. He asserted that as soon as the political landscape shifts, the U.S. will discard these leaders, unburdened by remorse, and proceed with its self-serving agenda. Well, look, just because that has happened time and time and time again doesn't mean it will keep happening forever. Mainly because the empires don't last forever. There are many ways to destroy the root of evil. You don't have to pull it out. He emphasized a metaphor here. This is a metaphor, stating there are alternative ways to address the root of evil without necessarily uprooting it, suggesting that chemicals symbolizing diplomatic or non-military means can be used. Okay, well, this is where we're at. The U.S. lost in Iraq, lost in Syria, lost in Afghanistan, and lost in Ukraine. And now we have this genocidal massacre in Gaza, which is absolutely related. Bibi wants to save his administration. Many Zionists want the final solution to the Palestinian question, and they feel the need to act quickly before the balance of power shifts further away from the West and to the South. On the U.S. side, I have to believe that some of the most deranged deep state functionaries like Victoria Nuland are thinking that the best chance for the U.S. is a wider war. This is insane, obviously, but it's sort of true. A bigger war sparked by the genocide in Gaza would be, say, 97% likely to be disastrous for the U.S., but without a war, it seems the end of U.S. global dominance is a virtual certainty. And as Lavrov says, they don't need or want to hack away at the root of all evil, the U.S. global empire. They need to deal with it economically and diplomatically by and large. So they are not wanting a bigger war. They would rather things play out the way that they have been. And the Gaza situation really radically changes things, or it throws some uncertainty in there, and that does not seem entirely accidental. This is a moment in history like no other. The range of possibilities is truly staggering. World peace or nuclear doomsday or something in between. The U.S. empire, including its Israeli outpost, is mired in a messy endgame on the devil's chessboard.